What's up, guys? Todd Jones from Stoked on Youth Ministry here, and I was recently asked a question that I think all of us at one point or another have been asked in student ministry. The longer I'm in the game, the more increasingly I get this question and I hear it, but the question is this: how long are you planning on being in student ministry? Right? When are you too old? When is it time to move on? How long are you going to be in student ministry? And there are a lot of reasons why people leave student ministry. Maybe it's just straight burnout and you're just done with it. It's time to move on because you are just stuck and overwhelmed and it's too much, right? Maybe you move on because you have another opportunity within the church to go to a different role, to do some other type of ministry in the church. Right? Maybe you move out of student ministry to just be done with ministry altogether, to go into the corporate world, to be done with it altogether. I don't know what it is, but there's reasons why people leave student ministry, and there's true real reasons there, but it still doesn't answer the question of when is it time and what are you going to do next? Like, when are you going to move on? When should you move on? When are you too old? And as I've wrestled with this question, as I've been asked a lot, there's three measuring sticks that I ask myself, three questions that I ask myself, and I encourage others to ask when they're answering the question of how long should I be in student ministry? When is it time to move on? Right? So here are the three questions that you can ask yourself that you can kind of figure out whether or not it's time to move on or whether you're content and you're good where you're at. The first question is this: the question of calling. The question of calling. And this question trumps everything else. Ultimately, if God calls you to something else, that's what you need to do. I've met quite a few people that have transitioned from student ministry to being a lead pastor, and they've made that transition quite reluctantly. They didn't want to do it. Their heart was in students. They wanted to be in students, but God has called them to something else. See, God's calling trumps whatever it is. So if God has called you to stay in student ministry, that's where you need to stay. If God has called you to something else, that's where you need to go. Now, discerning his call, that's a whole nother question. That's a whole nother video, trying to figure out how you know if it's really God calling. But ultimately, God's calling is the first question that you need to answer whether or not you need to stay in student ministry or it's time to move on. The question of calling is super important, because if you aren't called to student ministry and you're still trying to make it work, it's going to be like fitting a square peg in a round hole. It's not going to work. God's calling is super important. The question of calling. Question number two, the question of contentment. Question of contentment. Are you still excited to do student ministry? Is your heart still in it? Is this where you're like, man, I want to go to group. I love it. It's something that gets me fired up. I enjoy it. Are you still content with what you do? Now, I'm not talking about whether or not things are going well. We all know that there's ups and downs in student ministry. There's times that feel like you're just beating your head against a wall, and you might still love what you do, but it's really, really difficult. You might be in a season of difficulty. That's not what I'm talking about. The question of your contentment is, do you still have a passion for students? Do you still have a passion to serve God by serving students, by ministering to students? But if that passion's gone, if the answer to that question is, honestly, I'm not fulfilled. I don't get any joy out of it. It feels painful to have to do student ministry every week. Maybe that's one of the things that you can factor into your decision of when is it time to move on? Are you going to be a student ministry lifer, or is it time for you to move on to a different ministry? Okay? The question of calling, the question of contentment, and question number three is this. Question number three is the question of the condition of your heart. Now, I'm asked this often, and I'm sure you've heard this as well. When is a youth worker too old? At the age of a youth worker, is there an expiration date on being a youth worker? You hit this certain birthday, right? It's 45, it's 55, it's 65, it's whatever, and now you are no longer able to be in student ministry. And I want to tell you right now, I believe that is completely false, because I don't think that a number necessarily tells the story, but rather the condition of your heart. The condition of your heart. Have you gotten to a point yet where you think nothing can get better, nothing can change? Are you stuck doing ministry how you did it 20 years ago? And you think now everything should just fall into place because it worked 20 years ago, it should work now. The condition of your heart is not to see students meet Jesus, but rather to prove that you still have something, or you still have worth in the game, or whatever it is that you need to sort through. But you need to evaluate, you need to ask the question of the condition of your heart. Where's the condition of your heart? Is the condition of your heart one that's willing to do what it takes to reach students for Jesus? Is the condition of your heart one that hasn't gotten grumpy and thought to yourself, because we all know these people in the church, wow, that game's just a little too crazy, a little too loud, a little too whatever, and you're putting your preferences above what's going to work in reaching students? That's a question only you can answer, but the condition of the heart is a big one. It's not an age. I've had amazing, amazing volunteer leaders that were close to 80 years old working with students. But the most amazing part about these 80-year-old volunteers that I had is that they were willing to do what it took. And the condition of their heart was one in which that they would sit next to a student playing a video game that they've probably never seen and would definitely never play, but they were able to love that student while they did what they did, right? What is the condition of your heart? Those are the three questions. The three questions you need to ask. When is it time for you to step out of student ministry? When is it time to move on? I know there's a lot of factors in here, but when it comes strictly down to, hey, I've been in the game for a long time, when is it time to move on? The three questions you need to ask yourself is the question of calling, the question of contentment, and the question of the condition of your heart. You guys are awesome. My prayer for you is that you would be able to be in student ministry as long as possible and be effective as long as possible. You guys are absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for the work that you do with students, and thank you for being faithful to listening and watching and reading Stoked on Youth Ministry. I hope you guys have an amazing week, and we'll see you later.